So hello and welcome to another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host Carl Smallwood, and today we're talking about James Monroe, the era of good feeling. And at this point in Biographics, Geographics and Top 10s videos, I like to note that all the words you're about to hear me say were not written by myself, but by the person who wrote the script. That person today being Larry Holsworth. Give them a follow on the social media links provided below, because these videos are a team effort. I'm probably like the fifth or sixth person who gets their hands on the script, and I'm by no means the last, because we have editors and fact checkers and thumbnail makers and people working on ads behind the scenes, and they all do a very, very good job. The first 4 decades of what came to be called the American experiment were turbulent, to say the least. First, there was a revolution to be won, despite the opposition of, if you can believe it, a third of the population. A failed attempt at a national government under the Articles of Confederation led to the creation of a strong federal government, creating disputes over the role of states' rights that continue to the present day. Partisan politics created divides so wide that at one point a sitting vice president, Aaron Burr, killed a former secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in an illegal duel. For the cause of their enmity were many, and their core was a fundamental disagreement over politics. At least we've moved on from those days, right? So there were armed insurrections over taxes, over veterans' benefits, over slavery. During the John Adams administration, the United States fought an undeclared naval war with France. Jefferson sent the US Navy and Marines to fight a war along the North African coast and ordered an embargo against trade with Britain that proved ruinous to American commerce. Quarrels with Britain over free trade and freedom over the seas led to another nearly disastrous war with the British Empire. Settlers struggled into the western lands of the Northwest Territory, and the southern lands found hostile tribes opposing them and a federal government completely unable to defend them. Then came a period of about 8 years of relative peace, during which American commerce thrived, the nation's borders expanded through peaceable means, and the United States gained respect on the world stage. In the wake of the tumultuous years that followed, it became known as, quite simply and quite fittingly, the era of good feelings. It was the period of the administration of James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States and the last of the founders to hold the office of president. James Monroe was born in colonial Virginia on April 28, 1758. He was schooled at the best available facilities at the time, raised in a family of some prestige and privilege. Yet he knew the hard daily labour required of a farmer. At age 16, the orphan Monroe found himself responsible for raising his 3 younger brothers. An uncle assisted him by opening doors to the influential citizens of a colony, but in matters of business, he was pretty much on his own. His early education was rudimentary, even for the time, but sufficient to allow him to enter the College of William and Mary. His studies were frequently interrupted by the unrest that marked the Virginia capital of Williamsburg in the days leading up to the American Revolution. The young Monroe met and socialised with men like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and of course, George Washington, among others, that were leading the protest against perceived tyranny of the British. By the time the call to war came in 1775, Monroe was a fervent supporter of the Patriots' cause, driven by a desire for liberty and a young man's quest for adventure. Of the first 5 presidents of the United States, 4 came from the Commonwealth of Virginia: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And I didn't know that, and this is why I like doing videos on American history and specifically, influential figures from American history, because I get to learn about, our closest neighbour, America. And I'm often surprised by how little people in America know about their own history. Actually, I probably shouldn't say that's a bit inflammatory, but just there's something that has surprised me in my years of writing and researching, which has included articles and videos on aspects of American history, is just how little of it is known in specific detail. People tend to know the broad strokes, but the details are often lost in the weeds, as it were, which is why videos like this are, I think, very important. Even for me to have just a better overview of the history of one of the most powerful nations on the planet. Anyway, so all were involved in the American Revolution, the creation of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Like George Washington, James Monroe served in the Continental Army during the war. With Washington's army as a young lieutenant, he crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night 1776 to attack the Hessians at the Battle of Trenton. He was severely wounded at Trenton, nearly bleeding to death from a severed artery. He later returned to the unit, endured the winter at Valley Forge, and witnessed Washington's furious dressing down of General Charles Lee at the Battle of Monmouth. During his war service, Monroe became friends with several men with hard-to-pronounce names. These include Marquis de Lafayette, the Prussian volunteer, Baron von Steuben, and the Baron Johann de Kalb, who hailed from Franconian enclave in Bavaria. From these Europeans and others he fraternized with, Monroe developed a more worldly perspective on the American struggle, which to his fellow Virginians was more a battle between Englishmen over their natural rights. While Washington and Monroe fought on the fields of battle, Jefferson and Madison were largely relegated to the debates in Congress and the state legislature. Following his war service, Monroe returned to Williamsburg, Virginia, and resumed his studies at the College of William and Mary, which had been interrupted by the call to arms. He then read the law under the tutelage of his friend and mentor, Thomas Jefferson. Yes, that Thomas Jefferson. Before the war, Monroe had studied Latin, mathematics, and philosophy. After the war, he chose law because he said, in a rare moment of candour, for a budding lawyer, it presented an opportunity for, and I quote, the most immediate rewards. Read just that bit of money. Monroe kind of needed those rewards, though he was then a moderately wealthy planter by contemporary Virginia standards. He had little readily available liquid cash. His wealth was in the land he owned and the enslaved people that worked it for him. While reading the law under Jefferson, he befriended another of Jefferson's friends and allies, fellow planter James Madison. Madison, also a student of the law, suggested that Monroe consider politics as a means of helping build a law practice. In 1782, at Jefferson's urging, Monroe entered politics and was elected to Virginia's legislature, the House of Delegates. 2 years later, he was elected to the Congress of the Confederation. Monroe served in the Congress when it sat at Annapolis in Trenton and ultimately in New York City in the 1780s. During that time, he worked and corresponded regularly with Jefferson, Madison, Washington, and other Virginia luminaries, creating the core of what will be later known as the Virginia dynasty under the Constitution. He, like many ambitious politicians, fumed at the constraints imposed by the Articles of Confederation, which prevented Congress from accomplishing, well, really anything of substance. He also travelled extensively in what was then called the West, including western New York and Pennsylvania, the Ohio River Country, and the Northwest Territories. He was one of the principal authors of the Northwest Ordinance, which defined the first organised incorporated territory of the United States, which included the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and several parts of Minnesota. The Northwest Ordinance was one of the few accomplishments of the Confederation Congress to have any real lasting effect on American history. While serving in the Congress of the Confederation, James Monroe met New York socialite Elizabeth Cartwright. They were married on February 16th, 1786. Now, some sources claim the wedding took place in Manhattan's Trinity Church, while others cite her father's home at the location where the vows were exchanged. We don't really know for sure. What we do know for sure, though, is that Monroe was 27 years of age and his bride was all but 17. Yeah, let's move on. Eventually, they had 3 children together, a son, James Spence Monroe, who sadly died in infancy, and 2 daughters, Eliza and Maria. Monroe kept the surviving children close to him for pretty much the rest of his life, and when he travelled, as he did so extensively, he did with his family. Evidently, he remembered the sting of being orphaned as a child. In 1786, Monroe's term in Congress ended, and he relocated to an uncle's farm in Fredericksburg, Virginia. There, Monroe established a law practice and re-entered politics. He served in the House of Delegates and the Virginia Ratifying Convention, when that body was formed to debate and ratify the draft Constitution. In the debates over the merits of the Constitution, Monroe is most notable, at least to modern eyes, for his staunch opposition to the creation of the Electoral College. Monroe viewed the college, and some would say with a great degree of prescience, as being easily corruptible by political interests within the separate states, and he instead supported the idea of a direct election of the president by popular vote, i.e. the guy with the most votes gets to be president. His views did not prevail. And I'd make a joke here, but in the UK at the time of recording this, we are currently, sitting under our 4th, I think, unelected Prime Minister in a row. So, yeah. In 1789, Monroe ran for Congress under the newly adopted Constitution. His opponent was his friend, James Madison. And in a campaign that would be unthinkable to modern Americans, the 2 opposing candidates travelled the district together, presenting their views to the electorate and seeking their support. Madison prevailed in a district which had been drawn to his advantage by allies within the state legislature. The word gerrymandering had not yet been coined to describe such political machinations, but it is one of the earliest examples of such in American history at least. Yet Madison and Monroe's personal friendship was unaffected, and they remained close confidants and allies for the rest of each men's lives. And Yeah, all I can think of is that one Simpsons episode, just where Kang and Kodos take over like Bob Dole and Bill Clinton. Just because I get the best line of just Bill Clinton waking up like, oh man, I don't want to be in a tube. Anyway, Monroe followed his defeat by moving to Albemarle County near Charlottesville, where he purchased a large plantation near Jefferson's Monticello. He called his new estate Highlands. The following year, in 1790, the Virginia legislature selected Monroe to serve out the term of William Grayson, who had died while in office. Monroe thus had little time to enjoy his new home before returning to the federal government. At that time, the United States Senate met behind closed doors, its proceedings closed to public and prying eyes. Senators were appointed by their respective states rather than elected by the populace, and felt no real obligation to allow the people to monitor their activities. Monroe felt that such behaviour smacked of the medieval Star Chambers, and in early 1791 he proposed opening the Senate to the public it purported to serve. This idea was not popular, and it wasn't until 1794 that a sufficient number of senators agreed to allow the Senate to be subject to view by the people. The people, remember, they were elected to serve. By then, Monroe was on his way out of the Senate and into administration of a fellow Virginian, George Washington. Yes, that George Washington, who apparently he wasn't very good friends with. The two men disagreed on quite a lot, but that's a story for another day, I suppose. In 1794, Washington appointed Monroe as his minister to France, a position roughly equivalent to that of an ambassador in the present day. Despite frail health, Elizabeth accompanied her husband to Paris, as did the children. It was a, shall we say, stressful tenure in the French capital, then under the throes of the Reign of Terror. The Monroes learned that, again, people with hard-to-pronounce names like Marie Adrienne de Mortier Marquis de Lafayette, the wife of the Franco-American hero Lafayette, was imprisoned and threatened with beheading on the guillotine. Largely through Elizabeth's efforts, she was freed. The Monroes' young daughter Eliza also accompanied her parents to Paris and became quite good friends with Hortense de Beauharnais, the daughter of Josephine de Beauharnais, the stepdaughter of Napoleon. Yep. That Napoleon. Elizabeth Monroe and Josephine likewise became quite good friends, which no doubt helped shape James Monroe's pro-French views. Monroe came to be solidly pro-French and quite anti-British. What a legend. Adopting views that were opposite to those of the emerging Federalist faction in the United States. There, Jefferson adopted similar views, which were opposed by Washington. Party politics, Federalists in opposition to the Democratic Republicans, began to evolve in the American government. Though Washington famously, or I guess infamously, depending on which way you look at it, warned against the threat posed to the Constitution by political parties, he proved largely powerless to prevent their forming or to tone down the invective their respective adherents presented to public debate. However, he could deny a pulpit to those who participated in partisan debate and politics. In 1796, he recalled Monroe, replacing him as minister to France with William Pinkett. Washington then demonstrated his own political skill by ensuring that the letter relieving Monroe did not arrive in time to allow him to return to the United States in time to participate in that year's elections. Monroe returned to the United States in his plantation in Virginia until he was elected governor of Virginia by the legislature in 1799. He served in that office until 1802. When he returned to France, this time at the behest of President Jefferson, Monroe was tasked with assisting Minister to France Robert Livingston with negotiating a purchase of New Orleans and a license to trade on the Mississippi River. He was given a budget of about $9 million to persuade First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte to sell. Instead, Bonaparte, through his ministers, offered all of Louisiana for about $15 million. Livingston hesitated, believing he lacked the authority to approve such a sale. Monroe, on the other hand, urged Livingston to make the deal. In the end, Monroe prevailed, Jefferson approved, and the Senate, somewhat begrudgingly, gave their consent. The Senate did not disapprove of the value of the deal, which quite literally doubled the size of the United States for pennies an acre. Instead, members of both parties objected to the expansion of the powers of the presidency that the deal implied. Yet, in the end, it was simply just too good of a deal to pass up. All of Louisiana for $15 million. Monroe took note of the aggressive use of presidential power by Jefferson. He would return it in due time. His next mission was as an ambassador to Great Britain. There, he negotiated a treaty known as the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty, which redefined British and American trade. Jefferson, after receiving the agreement Monroe had negotiated, refused to present it to the Senate for them to, and I quote, advise and consent. Madison, then Secretary of State, supported the president. Jefferson's main objection to the treaty was that it did not address the British practice of imprisonment of American sailors on the high seas. Monroe considered this to be a side issue, and that the treaty would strengthen the trade relations between English-speaking nations. Jefferson's refusal to accept the treaty led to Monroe resigning his post in Great Britain. Monroe returned to Virginia and private life at Highlands in 1807. Then, in 1810, he returned to politics again. Once again elected to the Virginia legislature, and in 1811 he answered the call of President James Madison to enter the cabinet of Secretary of State. He served as Secretary of State through most of the War of 1812 and as acting Secretary of War during a large portion of it as well, holding both posts simultaneously. The war did admittedly not go well for Americans at first, but by late 1814 naval victories on the Great Lakes and the successful defense of Baltimore boosted American morale, as well as the bargaining position of peace negotiators. After the abdication of Napoleon in 1814, the newly elevated Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, was offered command of His Majesty's troops in North America. Wellington carefully reviewed the strategic situation in America and declined the command, informing the British Prime Minister that he would do well to negotiate a peace along the lines of status quo ante bellum, with no territorial gains or losses on either side. Wellington believed that the war was unwinnable for the British, following the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, but before it had been received by the Americans, a British army composed of many of Wellington's best troops against Napoleon was torn to pieces by an American force near New Orleans. Monroe recommended to Madison that the Americans accept the treaty. The Senate concurred, and the War of 1812 ended. Both sides claimed victory, though neither one accomplished any of their war aims, really. Monroe had performed well as Secretary of State and as acting Secretary of War, and victory at New Orleans had bolstered Americans' belief in itself. In 1816, Monroe ran for president as a representative of the Democratic Republican Party. The collapse of the Federalist Party, which nominated Rufus King, meant that Monroe was virtually unopposed. He won in a landslide. Although it wasn't known at the time, he would be the last of the founders and the last of the Virginia dynasty to win the office of presidency. So finally we get to the part that everyone is likely familiar with. When James Monroe became president in March 1817, the White House was still in the process of being rebuilt after being burned down by the British in 1814. Yes, sorry about that. The Monroes occupied a rented home on I Street until moving into the Executive Mansion, as it was then known, in 1818. When they did occupy the house, they brought with them a decidedly old-fashioned appearance. Men wearing their hair tied back in a queue had long gone out of style, except for footmen and servants. Monroe preferred that style and continued to display it throughout his presidency. Likewise, knee breeches and stockings had surrendered to pantaloons and boots many years earlier, but James Monroe continued to favour the former long after they'd gone out of style. In a later day, the citizens of Washington would adapt to the fashions of the White House, such as making cowboy boots popular when a Westerner was in the White House, but not in Monroe's day. The president appeared at levees and other official functions clad in a style he had worn some 40 years earlier, seemingly oblivious to the changes in garb and hairstyles he was surrounded by. And, you know, a guy just doggedly refusing to change his style because that's what he feels comfortable in, I can see the appeal. For some mysterious reason. His first administration dealt with problems along the southern border, which was then the northern border of the East and West Floridas, the Spanish colonies. Spain had been devastated by the Napoleonic Wars and was no longer capable of defending its territories from either Seminoles within or raiding pirates from outside of its borders. Monroe received the Florida issue by dispatching Andrew Jackson with American troops to occupy Mobile, Alabama, and Pensacola, Florida. Jackson's expedition was purportedly to quell the Seminole raids across the borders into Alabama and Georgia, but it also served as a show of force to Spanish authorities. Monroe then made Spain an offer, $5 million for Florida. The offer was accepted. Monroe followed the reasoning used by Jefferson in the purchase of Louisiana, which was, simply put, if the Constitution and subsequent law did not specifically bar the office of president from doing something in the national interest, he could do it. So Congress acquiesced. It's like, yeah, he told Jefferson he'd get him back. So in 1818, the territory of Missouri applied for statehood. Missouri was, at the time, a slave state, and non-slave states opposed its admission as altering the balance between slave states and free states. This is just a thing you have to deal with when you're talking about history. It sucks, we know, we'll move on quickly. So after bitter and rancorous debate, Missouri was admitted as a slave state, balanced by Maine's admission as a free state, and future admissions would follow the same balancing act, we suppose, for lack of a better term. Monroe endorsed the act, which was largely the work of Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, as it was then called, dominated the issue of slavery in the United States for pretty much most of the antebellum period. Also during the Monroe administration, Great Britain and the United States enacted treaties which demilitarized the border between the United States and Canada, creating what remains the longest demilitarized border between two nations anywhere in the world. Monroe then turned his attention to checking Tsarist Russia's expansion into into North America. Through the Russo-American Treaty of 1824, Russia's expansion into North America was limited to roughly the southern tip of modern Alaskan Panhandle. Eventually, the existing Russian settlements in present-day California were abandoned by St. Petersburg. During his second term as president, Monroe faced a crisis in South and Central America as the Spanish colonies, one by one, declared their independence and fought for freedom from Spain. Concerned that other European nations would attempt to take advantage of the situation and seize control of the former Spanish Empire, led Monroe to issue his policy of the end of colonization in the Americas by European powers, known to posterity as the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe announced the policy as part of his State of the Union message in 1823, and the doctrine, in essence, established United States protection over the North and South Americas, as well as much of the Caribbean. In truth, the United States lacked the military power to properly enforce the Monroe Doctrine, but it found an ally in Britain's Royal Navy, which enforced anti-piracy and anti-slavery laws throughout the region in their stead. The Monroe Doctrine remains James Monroe's greatest legacy, according to many scholars and historians, and has been cited as a justification for American actions by presidents including John F. Kennedy, Ulysses S. Grant, Ronald Reagan, Theodore Roosevelt, to name but a few. Monroe lobbied Congress hard for action on internal improvements, though he stipulated that the federal government could raise money for internal infrastructure, it could not build or operate it under the Constitution. Congress heard his requests for funding for roads, for canals, for bridges, for harbour improvements and other infrastructure in his annual State of the Union messages, and largely ignored all of them. In response, Monroe used his authority as the Commander-in-Chief of the US Army to instead just have the US Army Corps of Engineers improve navigation on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers instead. So, just like he did previously, it's like, if there's no rule that says I can't specifically do this thing, I'ma do the thing. James Monroe left office and returned to his Virginia plantation in 1825. He remained somewhat active in Virginia politics for quite a long time after leaving the presidency, including serving at the State Constitutional Convention in 1829. In 1830, his wife Elizabeth sadly passed away, and a grieving Monroe relocated to New York City, where he lived in the home of his daughter Maria. He died there in 1831. Somewhat appropriately for a founder and veteran of the Revolution, he died on July 4th, something shared by other presidents. But, can you let us know which ones they are? That's a bit of trivia for you. Let us know in the comments below. So originally interred in New York, his body was later moved to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia in 1858. Like each of the members of the Virginia dynasty who preceded him, all of whom served 2 terms, he left office considerably less well off financially than he had when he entered it. Also in common with the rest of the Virginia dynasty was his ownership of slaves. Again, this is one of those facets of history we kind of have to confront, even when talking about, heroes of the Revolution and famed American influentials. It's just, history kind of sucks sometimes. So his White House included enslaved peoples as servants, housekeepers, cooks, waiters, doormen, valets, and so on. To Monroe's credit, he did come to oppose the expansion of slavery and even support the creation of colonies in Africa for the support of freed African slaves, including Liberia. Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, was named in honor of him. Despite his wealth measured in land and slaves, Monroe was heavily in debt. He was forced to sell his Highland estate to satisfy his creditors. The sale included many of the enslaved people who resided there. And again, that's kind of a heavy topic here. And to move away quickly from that, Liberia's capital city being called Monrovia makes James Monroe one of only 2 presidents to have the capital of a country named after him. Can you guess who the other one is? Speaking briefly on his religious beliefs, of all the men who've occupied the White House as president, less is known about the religious beliefs of James Monroe than pretty much any other president. He did not refer to his beliefs in his speeches nor in his writings. No letters are known to exist where he discussed them. He did not attend church in Washington nor in Virginia. He did not explore his beliefs nor doubts in any known discourse we are aware of. Even the death of his own son at just 16 months of age did not cause him to address his faith, if any, in his correspondences or in any conversation with his friends, again, that we are aware of. At William and Mary in pre-revolutionary Virginia and even in Washington's Continental Army, attendance at services was often mandatory, yet Monroe never mentioned them in any context we're aware of. He is not regarded as one of the greatest American presidents, though most historians and scholars ranking such things rank him above the middle tier of chief executives. When added to his roles in fighting the Revolution, creating the Constitution, acquiring Louisiana and Florida, and securing America's future, his role as president becomes somewhat more substantial. The last of the revolutionary founders helped found the America of Manifest Destiny and the taming of the continent, as well as secure it from European tampering. Perhaps not one of the greatest presidents, but certainly far, far from among the worst. But, you know, that's a story for another day. And thank you to everybody for watching at home. I hope you found this video to be entertaining, informative, and educational. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things. And although I am British, I do have an interest in American history because it's interesting. There's a lot, you know, America is a relatively young country with a rich history that is seldom explored in media, and when it is, it's often a truncated, sanitized version. So I do appreciate the author, Larry Holsworth, from not shying away from things such as James Monroe, like, you know, owning slaves. That's kind of a suck-ass thing to do, but it was a thing he did, and it bears mentioning, because history isn't always nice, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. Anyway, thank you for watching, and as I always like to say, go out there and have the day that you deserve. Cheers.